The 18-year property cycle has become a tool that's been used by thousands, if not tens of thousands, of property investors to make better investment decisions. But is that now in the bin? Has COVID-19 destroyed the 18-year property cycle? Let's find out.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday property investors come to be informed and inspired. At a time like this, you'd probably pay a lot of money for someone to tell you what the future looks like. And something that we've turned to repeatedly to see a little bit of the future and make some predictions, which you can go and listen to, have on the whole turned out to be pretty accurate, is the 18-year property cycle. So if the property cycle is still something you can rely on, it's the most valuable tool that you can have in your toolkit at the moment. But is coronavirus just so big, such a catastrophic event, that we have to completely throw it out? Well, that's a view that you'll be able to come to by the end of this episode. And if you don't know what the cycle is right now, you have no idea what I'm talking about, well, don't worry, you're still going to be able to follow everything that we talk about. And you'll want to stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we're sharing a whole host of resources that you can use to become a true property cycle expert.
So at the moment, there's not a shortage of news in property. We're spoiled for choice. So much so that we have the Friday updates, the market updates, coming out every week. So if you like this type of thing, make sure you join us tomorrow for that. So Rob, as I've said, plenty of big news almost daily at the moment, and this is a biggie. The headline reads, UK mortgage payment holiday extended by another 3 months.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, the mortgage holiday scheme means that you can apply to your lender if you've been hit by coronavirus, if you've lost income as a result, to not make your mortgage payments for what was initially a period of 3 months. It doesn't mean they're cancelled. It just means that you don't have to pay them now. They'll get added onto the end of the term, and you'll end up paying slightly more interest because the interest will continue to build up over those 3 months, even though you haven't had to pay it. That was announced in March, which means that it would have started running out in June for the people who were first to get on it. What the government has decided is that the world won't be sufficiently back to normal by then to assume that everyone will be okay making their payments again, so they've extended it for a further 3 months. Now, at the time of recording this, they haven't announced what's happening to the temporary ban on evictions. That was also meant to run out at the end of June. It was in line with the mortgage holiday. So it seems almost certain that that's going to be extended as well for a further 3 months. Although when recording that hasn't actually been confirmed. So definitely listen to tomorrow's market update, because we record those just a couple of hours before the show goes out. So we'll be able to give you all the latest information there.
Now, before we get going, if you've not listened to last week's episode, you really should, because it's really going to help you with this week. Last week was a bit heavy. It was a deep dive into where we are from an economic point of view and where we think we may go. And there were some big, bold claims made. And we got lots of feedback from that episode, so thank you. But what we're going to do this week is use the 18-year property cycle to help frame some of the things that we talked last week and hopefully make it a little bit more accessible. And also, a lot of people have been asking us about the 18-year property cycle and asking questions like, where are we now? Is it broken? Are we in another mid-cycle wobble? If none of those terms really mean much to you, the good news is we've got you covered.
Yeah, if the property cycle is a new concept for you, then in Hub Extra, towards the end of the show, we're going to direct you to a course that we've put together on it, as well as a few important episodes that we've done going into the cycle in lots of detail. So stick around for that. But I'll give you enough of an overview now that you can follow along and know what we're talking about, even if you don't know all the ins and outs. So the 18-year property cycle is a pattern that goes back for about 200 years. And when you look at what's happened to property prices, or more precisely land prices, over that time, there's a pattern where prices start low, they creep up, they then aggressively go up in a boom, they hit a peak, and then they crash. And then the whole cycle starts all over again. The average duration of that cycle over the last 200 years is 18 years, hence the 18-year property cycle. So in the 18-year property cycle, the key event is this boom followed by a crash. In the lead up to that, there are two phases. There's a phase of slow and steady growth as people recover from the previous crash, start to gradually get their confidence back, and prices come back from their previous lows. Then there's a second stage of rapid, aggressive growth as that confidence turns into overconfidence and everyone's forgotten the previous crash. And in the middle of those two phases is what's called the mid-cycle wobble. This is where there's a brief period where prices stop growing or perhaps even fall a little bit before that second aggressive half of the cycle kicks on. Now, the important thing to understand is that this doesn't just happen randomly. There's a reason why each of these phases happens when it does, in the way it does. And if you watch our free course or listen to some of our other podcasts on this subject, you'll get to understand that in a lot of detail. But for now, that's all you need to know to understand the rest of this episode.
So the point of the 18-year property cycle is to be a guide to the future. It's meant to allow you to make better decisions because you've got an insight to where the economy should be moving, at least in a property sense. But here's the thing. Last week, we talked about two scenarios. One was that we could go into an economic meltdown, and one that we could go into an economic boom. And there wasn't much in between. We think that one of these two scenarios is going to play out. And by the end of the episode, spoiler alert, we came to the conclusion that we think the most likely event is that we have a boom and then that bust. So actually both play out. So what we're going to do now is look at all three options, that we start with a bust, we start with a boom, and then a third option, a combination of the two, where we go boom, bust, and see how that fits with the 18-year property cycle. Now, Rob, you don't need to be an expert on the 18-year property cycle to know that the bust scenario doesn't fit with where we are right now in the 18-year property cycle. This has happened before, though. It's not the first time the 18-year property cycle has effectively failed. But there were big reasons for that last time, and you could argue there's a big reason now.
Yes, so the cycle resets after each crash. So in our case, that's 2008, and we're counting forward from there. Going by the number of years from then until now, looking back over the past cycles, we should be coming up to the end of mid-cycle, getting over that little wobble I talked about, and going into the aggressive phase. If you look at the world around you right now, intuitively it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, if we get a crash instead, well, that wouldn't be the first time that the cycle has led us astray. In fact, it would be the third time in 200 years. Those previous times, world wars. Those wars were such major events that it shook up all the assumptions that the property cycle is based on. Therefore, the cycle got interrupted. It did not apply. So that's route one, Rob. COVID-19 equals war. If it has fundamentally changed everything, then that's it for the cycle. It ran from 2008 to 2020 and stopped. That's it.
It's not that far-fetched to see this situation as a war. Politicians have referred to it as a war. So you can justify this happening. It's not an excuse to say the 18-year property cycle doesn't work now because of this. It's just a reason. It's just a reason to why it's not working. It's failing. It doesn't exist. And it will have to start again in the future, just like it has done previously. So if after listening to last week, you feel that this scenario is the most likely to play out, then you should stop using the 18-year property cycle as a guide, as a tool to help you make better decisions, because it simply doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that the cycle has no value, doesn't mean that it hasn't been true in the past, doesn't mean that you can't use it again in the future, but it would mean that you've been unlucky to live through one of these rare periods where something so major happens that the normal models fail you. So you might come back to it again, but as your guide to what to do now and for the next few years, no use at all.
So that leads us to what happens if there's a boom. How does that fit with the 18-year property cycle? Well, actually, if you play it out year by year, where we should be in the cycle right now is exiting a mid-cycle dip and moving in to a boom scenario. So you could say that actually it's pretty close, maybe a little late, but the 18-year property cycle is not an exact science and it's always a guide, a rough tool. The timing's maybe a year or two out along the way. But an economic boom right now would tie very nicely to the 18-year property cycle. I think it's worth talking about what causes that boom, because it isn't just random. It isn't like, oh, wait, the cycle says there's a boom now. There's a boom. It doesn't work like that. When you watch the videos and listen to the podcasts that we've really gone into detail on the 18-year property cycle, one of the things you'll learn is that this boom is caused by stimulus. It's caused by cheap credit. It's caused by money being pumped into our economic system. And right now, that seems to be happening. So there is a strong argument to say, while it's a tad late, the boom scenario plays very nicely, and some may say very conveniently, to the 18-year property cycle.
And just like you said that there's a reason for the boom, I think it's worth pointing out as well that there's also a reason for this dip. Why mid-cycle would you suddenly have everything reverse before you go into the growth? The reason for that is that people start getting a bit nervous. The memory of the last crash is still relatively fresh. So after prices have been going up for a few years, starting to accelerate, people get cautious. well, hang on, should they be growing? Should prices be this high? Is this right? And that nervousness, until it's overcome, causes prices to drop. And we've heard versions of that argument when it comes to explaining what happened in the stock market. In the run-up to March, when this all kicked off, in the US at least, it had been the longest bull market in history. Prices were really, really high, and people were almost looking for an excuse for that to come to an end. People were nervous about valuations being where they were. Now, coronavirus is one hell of an excuse, but nevertheless, you could argue that that drop would have happened, maybe not as severe, if something else had come along. If anything else had come along, it didn't necessarily need to be on that kind of scale. So what I'm saying is not that some huge event magically comes along at exactly this point to cause the wobble. It's that because of investor psychology, the wobble is always going to happen at around that time. Therefore, some event, any event, turns up to spook people and cause prices to fall. And this just happens to be the biggest one of those that we've seen for nearly 100 years.
So what happens? How does this play out? Well, you would expect in a not too distant future to see the beginning of a boom. And realistically, you should start to see that, if you believe this to be true, at least the first signs of it in the next 12 months. Now, if you're sipping a hot drink right now, you may have just spat it out. What, we're going to start an economic boom in the next 12 months? I know, it's hard to see that happening because you're living in today. But 12 months ago, if I told you what today looked like, you'd probably choke on your hot drink. So just because it's different doesn't mean it can't happen. And as we briefly touched on today and went into more detail last week, all the economic stimulus that is being pumped into the global economy right now is unprecedented. It's never happened at this scale before. So the tools, the mechanism to create this economic boom are very, very much present. So the 18-year property cycle here absolutely does apply. So while this scenario looks pretty good for the 18-year property cycle, what actually suits it even more so is where we ended up last week, saying that actually we believe the most likely scenario, not guaranteed scenario, but most likely scenario to play out is an economic boom followed by a bust. But the size of the boom and the size of the bust will be substantial. And Rob, that's almost a paint by numbers exact version of what you would expect of the 18-year property cycle.
It is. And if you get the boom, then it's inevitable that you get the bust. If you look back, I don't think there's ever been an instance where you have a boom, then everything stays at that level for a while, where everything's great, and then after that, things just get even better. It doesn't work that way. Because of human psychology being what it is, you always get periods of overexuberance, but then suddenly everyone goes, hang on a minute, why are we paying so much for this? And then everything crashes because the confidence has evaporated. That's why this boom and bust has played out with such regularity over centuries. In this particular case, I think if it plays out as we believe it will, then we'll see an even more exaggerated version of this, because as well as just people's psychology being what it is, you've also got, as you said, Rob, unprecedented levels of stimulus being pumped into the system. That is going to exaggerate the boom, but then it's going to exaggerate the bust as well, because all those tools that you would normally use to try to rescue the economy when it's having a hard time have already been used, and governments will be powerless to do anything about it. This is what we're seeing now. Normally, what would happen in this situation when the economy starts to struggle is you'd cut interest rates. And okay, interest rates have been cut a bit, but they were already so low because they've been cut to try to rescue what happened in the last crash. As a result, that tool has been used, and they're moving on to new ones, like even more large-scale money printing and buying stocks and all manner of things. If that does the job this time and we don't have the crash now, then those tools won't be effective next time. So what's left? It could be the case that the answer is nothing. Therefore, you get this very aggressive boom resulting from the stimulus, followed by this very severe crash as it all unwinds and no one can do much about it.
So this is all very convenient, isn't it? It turns out that the economic cycle template that we've talked about for years fits perfectly with what's happening now. And yes, it may seem odd that I'm being cynical of ourselves, but I'm just saving people a job on YouTube, where the comments can be a little bit tastier sometimes, and we'll be our own dissenting voices right now. Because, Rob, I think it is worth us challenging our own opinions and thoughts here, because it is a bit convenient, and there are flaws. This is not perfect. This is not a perfect science. The 18-year property cycle isn't meant to be, but I think it's going to be useful for everyone to see it challenged, so it doesn't become almost like a religious template for property investors that we must adhere to and never challenge and always accept.
Oh, totally. This is a really real risk. There's such a danger that we are locked onto this idea and that, okay, well, the cycle says that there has to be a boom now. Therefore, there must be. Then we go out looking for evidence why that's going to be the case, ignore evidence to the contrary, go, unemployment, don't worry about that. Oh, here's a bit of data that supports our theory. And we end up being massively wrong because we're locked onto this idea of the cycle. So we've got to challenge it, and we'll do it more politely than people on YouTube will. So let's get the first hit in ourselves.
The first one that people who are familiar with the cycle may raise is, well, wait there, wasn't Brexit the mid-cycle wobble? Something we said was the mid-cycle wobble. I remember, unfortunately for us, we record our comments and thoughts, so we are on record of talking about how Brexit fits perfectly with the 18-year property cycle and how Brexit caused the mid-cycle wobble. So were we wrong, or is this another wobble? What do you think?
I think this ties into what I was saying earlier about that there's always something always comes along. There was the possibility that it was Brexit because that happened to come along at the right time. That doesn't necessarily mean that Brexit was, but maybe it was. Maybe Brexit was the event that caused the wobble, and what we're now seeing is unprecedented. This shouldn't be happening, therefore cycle is over. Or maybe Brexit wasn't actually the trigger. We were wrong about this, and now this is. Either way, we're wrong about something. I think what's possible, and be aware that this could just be me trying to resurrect a theory that I quite like here, is that there's more nuance to this than is normally discussed. Because remember, when you look back over a couple of hundred years, you're not looking in detail at any of that and you're averaging things out, whereas we're living through this right now. So there's probably lots of detail from past cycles that we were just not considering, and things didn't happen in this very neat, predictable way that they seemed to. In this case, Brexit did have an effect on house prices in London. And yes, to a point, that's because London and the industries in London could be more affected by the political realities of it than elsewhere in the country. But it's also the case that prices in London had grown more aggressively than anywhere else in the country. Prices in London picked up very strongly and very quickly after the last crash. Therefore, according to this mid-cycle wobble point, where people get a bit nervous about the growth that's already happened and you're looking for an excuse for things to calm down a bit, maybe for London, Brexit was it. But it didn't really affect prices in the rest of the country. So maybe that wasn't the true wobble that called an end to that stage of the cycle and signalled the beginning of the aggressive stage.
I touched on this point earlier as well, and I think it's important to raise again, just to make sure the message hits home. The 18-year property cycle doesn't happen because it says it's going to happen. At each stage of the cycle, there's meant to be triggers, things that happen to cause the next part. And so far throughout the cycle, this current one, those triggers have taken place. Now, in the past, because we thought Brexit was the mid-cycle wobble, we have said that the second half of this cycle, or the boom phase, the boom won't be as aggressive this time around because the wobble wasn't big enough, and other factors we've discussed in length before that we're not going to go into now. But ultimately, our belief was that this boom was not going to be a super aggressive one. Yes, it's a boom, and yes, it'll be higher growth than anywhere else in the cycle, but not like we've seen in previous cycles. But now, if you say, well, actually, Brexit wasn't a mid-cycle wobble, this is the wobble, this is quite a wobble, the stimulus levels are unprecedented, then the boom should be unprecedented. And then also, unfortunately, in around 2026, the bust will be unprecedented. So it's important to remember, this isn't a cycle because someone's documented it, and now it happens. There's reasons for each stage happening, which have also been documented, and they are playing out. I think it's also worth repeating that the concept of this cycle is decades old and it's not been created conveniently for now. It's just incredible how close it is to now. But also that while it was created decades ago, the data points are from centuries. So there's a lot to go at here. So as Rob said, while we're living in the now and it may feel very raw and every movement in the market and every decision feels huge, in years to come, it won't be quite as big. In decades to come, it's just a point in history. And centuries to come, we may not even talk about this time. Like we don't really talk about the Spanish flu that often. So while people, and I very much understand why they would do this, could be critical and go, wait a minute, guys, you've got too much attachment to this. You've talked about it for years, so you've found a way to justify it. I understand if you're cynical why you've come to that point of view. But we weren't at this point of view a few weeks ago. It's only when we've looked at all the information, come to our own conclusions, said, right, we think the most likely scenario is this. Ah, right, okay, that matches the 18-year property cycle. We didn't go, right, here's the 18-year property cycle. Let's go and find a way to squeeze it in. So while it may seem convenient, and I know this sounds really odd that we're pointing out flaws in our predictions and making you really think critically about what we've covered. Because most people, it seems in property, want you to believe everything they say. Actually, this leads back to the point last week where we talked about be critical, come up with your own point of view, listen to people who counter what we say, and then form your own opinion. But what the 18-year property cycle does, Rob, is it does give you a good guide, and it allows you to assess whether you believe this guide is true or not. But the word guide is really important here. It's not an exact science. We've never said it is. It's not going to give you a template by day exactly what's going to happen. But if you believe that it is playing out, it can be a fantastic guide that helps you make better decisions.
That's it. Every cycle is different. There's a tendency to overplay those differences. Like we said, because now is the time we're living through and it feels far more significant. There's always this temptation to go, okay, this particular thing hasn't happened before, but things like it have. In any given cycle, there are things happening that are new, and that mean that this cycle won't be exactly like the last. For example, going into this cycle, you had extremely low interest rates. That hadn't happened before. Therefore, you could say, oh, well, that means that you can't use the property cycle anymore. Actually, I think it affected what happened in the first half of the cycle and was a big reason why the first half was more quick and more aggressive than it normally would be. But it's not a basis to throw the cycle out completely. Another effect of everything being slightly different each time is that the timings are never going to be spot on. And I prefer to call it the property cycle than the 18-year property cycle, because I think the 18-year bit is a bit misleading. The 18-year part is an average. That's the average length of the cycle over the last 200 years. It doesn't mean that this cycle can't be 16 or 20. It could even be the biggest outlier yet and be way off. But it's not the duration that's important. It's the sequence of events. And at the moment, Rob, I've got enough faith in the sequence of events and the underlying reasons why those happen to keep my faith in the property cycle and to say that on balance at the moment, I think the most likely thing is that it is going to play out as expected. But there's no doubt that this is big. This is a real test. And it's possible that the cycle will break down. As we've already discussed, we are second guessing ourselves. We are questioning our assumptions here. And you have to do that in this kind of scenario. But has coronavirus broken the property cycle? It's too early to say that it has, but it's also too early to say that it hasn't. But I think by the end of 2020, we'll know a lot more.
Now it's time for Hub Extra. You already know what it is because we've told you, but it's really important that you take advantage of this. Because if you know a little bit about the 18-year property cycle and you're basing all your decisions on that, then that's not enough. You really need to understand the mechanics of it and why these things happen. But don't worry, we've got you covered. We have a full course on this subject in the Property Hub University. Now, the great thing about our university is it's absolutely free. So go to our website, propertyhub.net, and check out the course. You can also go to the show notes for all of these links I'm about to refer to. Another video that you will want to watch, though, just to understand the general principle of market cycles, is a fantastic video by Ray Dalio, which is how the economic machine works. Again, we'll link to that in the show notes. And then we've put together a trilogy of podcasts, all back to back, which start with how the economic machine works, then moves into the 18-year property cycle year by year, part 1 and part 2. And they were episodes 269, 270, 271. So if you go and watch that video by Ray Dalio, listen to those podcasts, and then take the course at Property Hub University, you're going to be close to being an expert on the cycle. But that will then help you make a decision on whether you buy into this or you don't. But you shouldn't dismiss it or base all your decisions on it until you understand it. And once you understand it and you educate yourself, you're going to make far better decisions.
So that's us done for this week. And you may be relieved to hear that that's us done for coronavirus and high-level economics, for 1 week at least. Because while it's extremely important to understand the economics that underlie your investments, all you can really do is what you have control over. One of those things is doing deals. And that is what we're talking about next week. But there is a lot going on at the moment, and it is important to stay on top of it. So we're going to be back to cover all of that in tomorrow's Market Update podcast. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.